Morning, my son called to tell me he'd gotten married. I was in the middle of repainting the back fence. I remember that detail because the brush was still in my hand when I answered, and I stood there so long without moving that the paint dried stiff against the bristles. Ruined the whole brush. I didn't even notice until hours later. We did it at the courthouse, Dad, just the two of us. Lena wanted it that way. I didn't say anything for a moment. I think I was waiting for the part where he'd laugh and say he was joking. That part never came. Congratulations, I finally managed. Because what else do you say? What do you say when your only child, the person you spent 30 years building your entire life around, calls you after the fact, casual as a weather report, to let you know the biggest day of his life happened without you in it? I said congratulations. I told him I loved him. And then I went back to the fence and I stood there staring at it until the sun started going down. My son's name is Elliot. He's 31 years old, and for the first 12 years of his life, I was the only parent he had. His mother, Pamela, left when he was 3. I won't spend much time on that part of the story because, honestly, I made my peace with it a long time ago. She had her reasons. I had my grief. And somewhere in between, there was a little boy who needed breakfast made, and shoes tied, and someone to show up to his school plays. So I showed up, every single time. I worked in commercial contracting for 22 years, estimating, then project management. Then I started my own small firm out of a converted garage in Dayton, Ohio when Elliot was 7. It wasn't glamorous. Some years were genuinely hard, the kind of hard where you lie awake running numbers in your head and trying to figure out which bill to pay first. But I built it slowly, and I built it right, and by the time Elliot was in high school, Donovan Contracting had a real office, 6 full-time employees, and a reputation in the region that I was quietly proud of. I named the company after my own father. He died before I got the chance to show him what I'd built with it. Elliot grew up inside that business in a lot of ways. Summer breaks, he'd come in and help with filing, learn the estimating software, sit in on meetings with subcontractors. He never complained about it. I think he genuinely liked it. When he graduated from Ohio State with a degree in construction management, I cried in the parking lot of the ceremony venue and hoped nobody saw me. He came to work with me full-time at 24. Within 2 years, he was handling our largest accounts. I started thinking, quietly, no pressure, that one day the business would be his, that everything I'd built would pass to him in a clean, proper way, that I'd get to retire knowing it was in good hands. Then he met Lena. He'd been dating her for about 4 months when he first mentioned her name. I asked the normal questions. Where did she grow up? What does she do? How did you meet? He said she was from out west somewhere, that she worked in marketing consulting, and that they'd met through a mutual friend at a bar. Fine, normal enough. I asked when I could meet her. He got a little vague. She was busy, she traveled a lot for work, the timing was never quite right. I didn't push. Elliot was always a private person, and I learned over the years that pushing him on personal things usually just made him go quieter. But months went by and the timing was never right. And the more I noticed myself waiting, the more I noticed other things too. Little things at first. Elliot started canceling our standing Sunday dinners. We'd had those every week for almost 3 years. Nothing formal, just the two of us at my kitchen table or occasionally going out somewhere. He'd miss one, apologize, make the next one. Then he started missing 2 in a row. Then he'd show up distracted, checking his phone, leaving early. Then he'd show up distracted, checking his phone, leaving early. I told myself it was normal, new relationship. Of course, his attention was elsewhere. Then he asked me, in the middle of a workday, to add Lena to the company's health insurance plan. She's not an employee, I said. I know, but we're basically together full-time now. She doesn't have coverage through her job. I explained patiently that I couldn't just add a girlfriend to a business insurance plan. There were liability issues. There were legal questions. It simply wasn't how it worked. He nodded and dropped it, but something about the way he asked, the way it came out rehearsed, like he practiced the words, stayed with me. 2 weeks later, he asked if Lena could be added to the business checking account to help with administrative tasks. I said no. He didn't argue. He just nodded again and went back to his desk. But after that, things got cooler between us. Not cold, just cooler. The comfortable ease we'd had for years developed a thin layer of distance that I couldn't quite name. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. I really did. I told my friend Bert, we've known each other since our kids were in middle school, about what was happening one evening over dinner. He listened and then said, very plainly, Walter, someone's working on him. I don't know who and I don't know what they want, but that boy's being worked on. I'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't let myself say it out loud. The next morning, I walked into Elliot's office and I closed the door. I need to meet her, I said, not asking anymore. I need to meet the woman my son is serious about. That's a reasonable thing for a father to ask. He looked uncomfortable. She's just private, Dad. She doesn't really do the whole meet the parents thing. She doesn't do the meet the parents thing, I repeated. It's not personal. Elliot, I'm not just the parents. I'm the only family you have. And she's apparently important enough that you've been together for 9 months and you're asking to add her to business accounts. I think I'd been more than patient. He said he'd talk to her. 2 days later, he called me from the courthouse. I want to be honest about what the weeks after that felt like, because I think it matters. I wasn't just hurt. I was scared. There was something happening that I didn't understand, and I'd spent enough years in business to know that when you can't see clearly what's in front of you, that's exactly when you're most at risk. I went back through the last year in my head, looking for things I'd missed. The insurance request, the bank account request, the way Elliot had gotten vague when I'd asked about her background, the way he'd stopped mentioning any friends of his own. I thought about how isolated he'd become from his own life, and how that isolated he'd become from his own life, and how that isolation seemed to have started right around the time Lena arrived in it. I did something I'm not especially proud of, but I do again. I hired a background check service, the kind small businesses use when they're vetting new contractors. I gave them Lena's full name, which I'd gotten from the marriage license announcement that ran in the county records database. Her last name was Voss. The report came back 4 days later. Lena Voss had 2 previous marriages. The first in Nevada ended in divorce after 14 months. The second in Colorado ended after less than a year. In both cases, the divorce filings referenced financial disputes. In the Colorado case, her ex-husband's attorney had documented a pattern of attempting to access joint business assets within the first months of the marriage. She was 38 years old. She had no consistent employment history. Her marketing consulting business had no web presence I could find, no clients I could verify, no office address. I sat with that report for a long time. I didn't go to Elliot right away. I knew if I came at him with paperwork and accusations, he'd get defensive. And the defensive Elliot would run straight back to her and tell her everything. Then she'd be prepared, and whatever she was planning would simply move faster. Instead, I called the family attorney. His name is Philip, and he's been handling my business legal work for over a decade. I explained the situation without using any names, just the broad shape of it. He listened, and then he said something I wrote down. Protect the asset before you address the relationship. Once something's transferred, recovering it is brutal. Protect first. So that's what I did. Over the next 6 weeks, quietly, I restructured the business. I'd been meaning to move Donovan Contracting into a proper LLC with a trust structure for years, the kind of setup that protects a business from personal liability and from being treated as a personal asset in legal proceedings. I just hadn't gotten around to it. I got around to it now. I also had Philip draw up a new succession framework. Under it, Elliot was still the intended heir to the business. But the transfer would be conditional and structured. It couldn't happen all at once, and it couldn't be influenced by a spouse unless that spouse had been part of the family for a minimum of 5 years. It was all legal, all above board, and none of it was secret. It would simply never come up unless someone went looking. Then I waited. Elliot brought Lena to my house for the first time about 3 weeks after the wedding. I had made dinner, pot roast, which had been Elliot's favorite since he was about 8 years old. I had the table set nicely. I was calm. She was, I'll admit, very polished. Warm handshake, good eye contact, compliments about the house. She was attractive in that particular way that some people are when they've figured out how to present themselves. Controlled, practiced, pleasant. She asked questions about my work and seemed interested in the answers. Elliot relaxed visibly in her presence. That part hurt to watch. Halfway through dinner, she brought up the business. Naturally, or what was meant to seem natural, she said she'd been so impressed hearing about everything I'd built and asked about my plans for the future. Retirement timeline, what succession looked like. I haven't finalized anything, I said pleasantly. These things take time to structure properly. She nodded. Of course. Though with Elliot being so involved, it would make sense for him to start having more formal ownership, right? For tax purposes, if nothing else. You know a lot about business tax structure, I asked. A small pause. Just what I've picked up. From your consulting work? Among other things. I smiled at her and changed the subject. After dinner, after they'd gone, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I thought about my father, who built things with his hands before I was born, and what I would say to him if I could. I thought about Elliot at 8 years old asking me if we were going to be okay when a bad quarter had left us short. I told him we were always going to be okay. I told him I'd make sure of it. I was still going to make sure of it. Things escalated faster than I expected. Elliot came to my office about 2 weeks after that dinner, sat down across from me, and slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a proposal. Her language was all over it, I could tell, suggesting that Elliot be formally moved to co-owner status in preparation for succession, with immediate equal signing authority on all company accounts. I read it carefully. Then I set it down. Where did this come from? I asked. Lena helped me draft it. We've been talking about it. Have you? Dad, I'm 31. I've been working here full-time for 7 years. It's reasonable to want something formalized. Elliot, I have no problem with eventual formal ownership for you. I've always planned for that. But this document gives immediate access to accounts to both of you, and your wife has no role in this company. He shifted in his seat. She's my wife. She's someone I met 3 weeks ago. The temperature in the room dropped. He picked up the paper and stood. I expected this. She said you wouldn't be open to it. She told you what to expect from me. He left without answering. That night, he sent me a text that I still have saved. It said, "You've had control over everything my whole life. I'm an adult. It's time to stop treating me like I need permission." I read it probably 15 times. Because I recognized those words, not from Elliot. Elliot had never talked to me like that in 31 years. Those words had been put there by someone else. I called Bert. I called Philip. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove out to the cemetery where my father is buried, and I sat there for about an hour just thinking. My father lost a business once when I was young. A partner he'd trusted had slowly, quietly moved assets until there was nothing left to move. Dad never really recovered from it. Not financially, not emotionally. It took something out of him that never came back. He used to say the worst part wasn't the money. The worst part was that he hadn't seen it coming, and that made him doubt every judgment he'd ever made. I wasn't going to feel that way. I was going to see it coming. What happened next, I found out only later, pieced together from things Elliot told me after the fact. About a month after our confrontation in the office, Lena started pushing harder. She'd apparently been doing research, found out through county records that I'd restructured the business. She knew something had changed. She told Elliot that I was cutting him out, that the restructuring was designed to disinherit him, that he needed to take action before I locked him out completely. She was wrong about the intent, but she'd read the existence of the structure correctly, and she used it the way she used everything, as a lever. She convinced Elliot to consult with an attorney about whether he had any grounds to challenge the business structure. He went to a consultation. I found out later because the attorney happened to be someone Philip knew from bar association events. The attorney apparently took one look at the documents Elliot brought in and told him there were no grounds for a challenge, that the structure was solid and legitimate, and that Elliot's interest was fully protected as the designated successor, just on a schedule, not immediately. Elliot came home and told Lena what the attorney said, and that's when her reaction gave her away. He told me later that she didn't seem disappointed. She seemed, his word, recalculating, like she was running a new set of numbers. She asked him what the 5-year condition was exactly, who was named as secondary beneficiary if Elliot predeceased me, whether there were any other assets like real estate or retirement accounts that existed outside the business structure. Elliot said that was the moment something shifted for him. It was a retirement account question, he told me, because she'd met you twice, and she was asking about your retirement accounts. He showed up at my door on a Tuesday evening without calling first. He looked like he hadn't slept. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table we'd sat at for 30 years of Sunday dinners, and he talked for a long time. He told me she'd been monitoring his phone, that she pushed him to cut off his college friends one by one, always with a specific reason that seemed reasonable in the moment, that she told him early on that families like his, her words, families like his, tended to use money as control, that I'd always be holding something over him unless he took a stand. He said it so slowly that I could hear how long he'd been carrying it. "I'm so sorry, Dad." His voice broke on it. "I don't know when I stopped thinking for myself. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't say I'd seen it coming. I just said, you're here now." And I refilled his coffee. He moved out of the apartment he and Lena had been sharing within the week. He stayed in his old room at my house for a while, which was strange and not strange at all. Strange because he was 31 years old, not strange because it was his home as much as mine. Lena, to nobody's surprise, retained an attorney almost immediately. She had legal grounds for spousal support given the length of the marriage. In Ohio, that calculation wasn't straightforward for such a short union, but there was still a process. She also tried to argue that Elliot's role in the business entitled her to a portion of its valuation as a marital asset. That's where Philip earned his fees. The trust structure made the business essentially unreachable. Elliot's interest in it was a future conditional interest, not a current asset he held, which meant there was nothing for Lena's attorney to claim a marital share of. The whole thing collapsed fairly quickly once the documents were reviewed. She was left with what she'd come in with, which was very little. The marriage had lasted under a year. Elliot threw himself back into work. In some ways, he was more focused than he'd ever been, like he was making up for lost time, or proving something to himself. We didn't talk about it constantly, but we talked about it honestly when it came up, which I think is the only way fathers and sons can really work through something like that. He asked me once, about 6 months later, when I'd started to worry. I told him about the insurance request. He was quiet for a moment. "That early? That early. Why didn't you say something?" "Because you would have defended her. You weren't ready to hear it." He nodded slowly. "You're right. I wouldn't have listened." "I know," I said. So I protected what I could protect, and I waited. He looked at me for a long moment. That must have been hard. It was. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Not the legal work, not the restructuring, but the sitting still, watching my son get further away and not being able to pull him back directly, not knowing for certain how it would end. But I'd raised him to be someone worth waiting for. That part I'd been sure about, even when I wasn't sure about anything else. I formally transferred 25% ownership of Donovan Contracting to Elliot on his 32nd birthday. We didn't make a big event of it. Berg came over, Philip was there, a couple of the long-term employees who'd watched Elliot grow up. I had his grandfather's name framed on the wall in the conference room, the original letterhead I'd designed when I first opened, the one with Donovan Contracting in plain block letters. I told him that his grandfather never got to see this, but I had enough certainty in me to believe he'd have been proud. Elliot shook my hand and then pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than either of us planned for. "I've thought a lot, since everything happened, about what I would have done differently. I've come to the conclusion that I wouldn't change the waiting. I would have found a way to tell him sooner that I wasn't trying to control him, that all of it was because I knew what he was worth and I wasn't going to let someone take that from him before he could see it himself. But maybe some things a person has to find out on their own. Maybe the lesson about who loves you and who's counting your assets only lands when you're the one who discovers it." I just made sure that when he finally did see it clearly, there was still something left to come home to. The fence in the backyard needed repainting again last spring. Elliot came over on a Saturday and we did it together. We talked about a project we were bidding on, about whether to hire a third estimator, about nothing much. It was, honestly, one of the best days I've had in years. There's a version of the story where I charged in early, where I sat Elliot down the moment the insurance request came across my desk and told him exactly what I thought was happening. In that version, I'm direct, and I'm right. And he doesn't listen, and she turns him further against me, and I lose him entirely for years instead of months. I've thought about that version a lot. It's not the one I'd choose. What I've come to understand, really understand in the way you only can after living through something, is that being right isn't the same as being effective. I was right about Lena from almost the beginning. I could see the shape of what she was doing, even when I didn't have the details confirmed. But being right out loud, at the wrong moment, to someone who wasn't ready to hear it, That would have cost me everything. The intelligence without the patience would have been just as useless as having no intelligence at all. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell stories like this one. Everyone focuses on the clever move, the legal structure, the moment the plan worked. But the actual hard part was the 6 months in between. Watching my son grow more distant and choosing, deliberately, not to pull on the rope. Understanding that some situations require you to protect what you can protect and trust the rest to time. Elliot didn't find his way back because I forced him to. He found his way back because something in him, something I'd spent 30 years trying to build, was still intact enough to recognize the truth when it finally sat directly in front of him. The moment he told me it was the retirement account question that broke the spell, I wasn't surprised. That question was too naked. Even someone deep in it can only ignore so many naked questions before the pattern becomes impossible to unsee. What I think about now, when I consider what I want to pass on to him alongside the business, is this. Your judgment is the most valuable thing you own. More valuable than any asset, any account, any structure a good attorney can build, because all of those things can be rebuilt if they're lost. But a person who has learned to doubt their own judgment, who has been slowly trained to believe that their instincts are wrong and their closest relationships are suspect. That kind of damage is quieter and takes much longer to undo. Lena understood that. She went after his judgment before she went after anything else. And the reason she ultimately failed isn't that I outmaneuvered her legally, though that helped. It's that she couldn't fully dismantle what was already there. 30 years of a father showing up, being honest, being consistent, that's not nothing. It doesn't disappear because someone clever decides to work against it. It goes quiet for a while and then it comes back. I painted the back fence again last spring. Elliot came over on a Saturday and we did it together. And we talked about work and nothing in particular. And it was one of the better days I've had in a long time. That's the ending I'd have chosen if I'd been writing it myself. It took longer to get there than I would have liked, but it held.